Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 245 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions, your one-stop shop for all things FCPA compliance related. Today, I have with me Michael Bassett. Michael is the Assistant Director of the Governance, Compliance, and Risk at the Conference Executive Board in Canada. The Conference Executive Board is both in the United States and Canada, and it helps educate executives on various matters generally related to corporate governance, but also in leadership, in anti-corruption, anti-bribery, and things that the modern executive must know. The episode comes in at just over 24 minutes. I think you will find it very interesting, and thank you very much for listening. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today it is my distinct pleasure to have Michael Bassett, the Associate Director for Governance, Risk, and Compliance, or Governance, Compliance, and Risk for the Conference Board of Canada. I've had the opportunity to work with Michael on a couple of educational programs his organization has put on, and I thought it would be a great podcast if he could visit with us and tell us a little bit about what not only he does, but the Conference Board of Canada does. So with that somewhat long-winded introduction, Michael, welcome and thank you for visiting with me today.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. We're really pleased to have the invite and to have the opportunity to chat with you and to your listeners as well.
Michael, could you tell us what does the Conference Board of Canada do?
Sure. So our focus, we are Canada's largest independent, not-for-profit think tank. So we are really well known for our economic forecasting. We do a lot of work on the education side, and where you know us is because we have a line of business that we call our executive network business, which is really predicated on the idea that leaders learn best from other leaders. So what we try to do, we have about 4 of these groups across the country. Each is focused on a particular role or issue or topic that's of interest to organizations. And the one that we have is the Corporate Ethics Management Council, which is focused on ethics and compliance. And so that's really for general counsels, chief compliance officers, chief ethics officers. And my job is to create a compelling enough reason for them to come so that they can have a dinner together and have conversations alongside a meeting and to hear from speakers like yourself. So that's sort of the executive network side of the conference board.
So what's your role in all this, Michael?
So as you sort of introduced me, I'm the Associate Director for Governance, Compliance, and Risk. And what that means is that I lead our relatively small team working on governance research. We have networks in ethics and compliance. We have a strategic risk council under our group. And then we'll do research on issues in ethics, in compliance, in governance. And we also work with what we call our Directors College, which is a director education program that we have here in Canada focused on making sure that directors, as they get onto boards, know what their role is, know what the difference between being a director is and being a senior executive, and helping them understand what their responsibilities are in that role. So we sort of work, that's sort of our main breadth of focus. So I lead that group for us here in the conference board.
Well, Michael, I'm glad you brought that up because it's one of the things that I wanted to get into or have a little bit more of a conversation with you around, which is the Directors College, because two things really struck me in kind of reviewing the information about it. One is that this is not a Michael sit in Toronto, pontificate to the rest of Canada. This is truly a trans-Canadian opportunity, but also resource. You go, it looks like to me, all over the country and help people to understand what their roles are as directors, whether they're looking to move to the director level, at the director level, or some other opportunity.
Yeah, what we try to do is we try to create reasons for them to go. So it's a 6-module course, and we call it a residential course. So people go for a weekend. We're very much of the belief that part of the benefits of these sorts of learning opportunities is the people that you meet and the connections that you meet throughout. So, and we really want people to be immersed in it. Our experience is that learning by correspondence, while it can be effective, is not sometimes the best way to go about some of these things around directorship. And our experience is that one of the most important things for directors to understand in this governance world is that it's not only the technical responsibilities. A lot of what really drives good governance is interpersonal dynamics, behavioral issues, and so we focus quite a lot on that side of what it is to be a director in the training, so much so that in our final module we actually bring in trained actors who will come in and we do a simulation. It's a board simulation process. And so these actors come in and they will play the role of the chair or the governance committee chair, and they'll go through a full session and you sort of see the personality types and try to help directors understand the ways in which they're going to respond under certain kinds of pressures and when they see certain types of behaviors that will affect governance.
And I guess one of the other things that struck me to even further that conversation, Michael, or further that thought is you guys talk about stewardship. And frankly, that's not a word we hear in the States associated with a board of directors, but you've actually put out a publication entitled Stewardship Review, where you bring together a group of leading authors or leading thinkers to talk about boards as stewards of a wide variety of things, obviously shareholder value, but also for other stakeholders, employees, the environment, and it's just a different way to think that perhaps we do here in the States.
Yeah, and part of that is the difference in our regulatory context. We're a little less clearly defined that the interest of the shareholder must be the primary. So we really have a bit more of a stakeholder-based approach here in Canada, to a certain degree. But when we think about good governance, we certainly think that the role of the board as a steward of the organization, providing that oversight, the strategic guidance, helping with the risk appetite, those are all things that we think inherently involve considering more than one stakeholder or shareholder. And so being a steward seems to be a term that I think certainly seems to resonate in the Canadian governance world. It's something that we believe in here at the Conference Board for sure.
Michael, the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics released a survey this week where chief compliance officers and other senior executives talked about what they saw as their greatest risk. And one of the things that has really jumped to the top of the list is cybersecurity. And that's a subset perhaps of privacy. But I noted that appears to be equally, at least a topic. In Canada, you've got an upcoming conference, or rather you just had a conference on cybersecurity. Do you have any general sense of that issue for board members in Canada?
Yeah, we've done some work with groups that focus on cybersecurity. And I think like a lot of organizations and a lot of folks within organizations, this whole threat of cybersecurity seems overwhelming for many boards. it's one of the things where you can talk to the people in the know, and they can scare the pants off of you because they know the tricks of the computer, and they know how people are targeting stuff and how they can get into it. And this is the kind of knowledge that most boards don't have. And frankly, it's one of the things that we've looked at around, do boards need to start thinking about within their board skills matrix, considering, do they have someone with any kind of IT knowledge, maybe not necessarily a cybersecurity expert, but someone who can provide the assurances that what's being done is sort of an appropriate level. And these are crucial issues for boards because they've seen places where hackers might have gotten in to get information, or frankly, through a lapse or bad security policies, customer information or client information or very sensitive information was all released. And those are tangible things. People get fired, boards get dismissed. So they're really trying to figure out how to manage it. But it is certainly not an easy subject, and it's one of those things where you can often talk to some of the advisors who also tend to have a solution that they're selling. And so it's hard to parse who to listen to and when you're getting the right information. You sort of have to defer. A lot of boards are tending to have to defer on this and are uncomfortable with the degree to which they have to defer. So I can certainly understand why it was one of the top issues, and it's a big issue for a number of boards as well as folks in that compliance world.
Michael, what are some of the other issues that either you think are important to board members in Canada, or conversely the research has shown, or you've done surveys on that have been bubbled up to the attention?
Well, one of the big things that boards are really trying to sort out and have been paying a lot of attention to is risk. Understanding what a risk appetite is, and frankly, following the 2008 downturn or recession, a lot of boards took a very risk-averse approach, and we're hearing from a number of directors that they're now experiencing almost a fatigue around risk and risk aversion. They want to get that risk appetite fixed because opportunity is inherently risky, and so organizations need to make sure that they're not being too cautious. In Canada, we have a tendency, and our work here at the Conference Board has borne this out, and others have as well, that we tend to be a more risk-averse society, just broadly, and we compare ourselves, to the U.S. And so when we're looking at that risk aversion, we know that is an economic barrier for us because we are missing opportunities. So a lot of boards are trying to open up the door on that risk appetite, be more clear, give the right signals around an appetite for opportunity without being too far. And that's a tricky dynamic for a number of boards to take. So that's one issue that people are looking at. Did you want to talk about that, or should I
Sure.
go through some other ones? Well, another one, we've got a research report that's just come out. We do a survey on director compensation and board practices, and we've done this here at the Conference Board, not me, but the Conference Board's been doing this for almost 4 decades now, really looking at tracking what's happening in boards, how are they paid, those sorts of structures. And we're seeing increasingly what we're interpreting as a recognition of the professionalization of a director. When we started out 40 years ago, it was, a group of 30, largely white men who maybe all knew each other, were in the same social circles. The boards were, their rigor was not as intense, and frankly, the pressures that they were under and the scrutiny they were under was also not as intense. And over the last 4 decades, and certainly over the last 20 years, and again, even the last, I would say, 5, we see that pressure coming up. We see the responsibilities and the scrutiny of the director and the role of governance in the organization and how they're directing the organizations increasing. And so the pressure on directors has also been ratcheting up. And so we're finding that now some of the structures within boards are reflecting that this is really not a hobby, it's not a part-time job, it's not something that's nice to do. These are real jobs with real responsibilities that you need to compensate people appropriately for. And there's a couple things that I think in our most recent work that validate that. And people may disagree, but this is my interpretation. One of them is that we're seeing fewer and fewer organizations providing a per meeting fee for their directors. Mm-hmm. So it used to be you'd get a stipend, and then every time you showed up at a meeting, you'd get another little stipend. And so the more you showed up at the meetings, you'd make a little bit more, but it was more like here's a treat for coming out to the meeting. Right. And we're seeing fewer and fewer organizations using that because they are expecting their directors to be there and to be prepared and to have their work. And so it's more like a salary. It's not something where you're being paid like a part-time job where you get an extra little bit for coming in. Maybe you're on that committee and get a little extra. So that's one example where we see some professionalization. And then the other one is just around the structure of boards. Boards seem to have, in Canada, for the most part, shrunk down to the smallest grouping of individuals that can still effectively function through the committee structures, that can still have effective discussions. So we're seeing boards that are getting smaller and more focused on skills and evaluation of the board to make sure that they've got the right people and that they're getting the turnover that's required to ensure that people maintain that independence that people are looking for when they want an independent director. If you have a person who's come in as an independent director and they've been on your board for 20 years, odds are you really shouldn't consider them to be independent anymore. They're now fully ensconced in the organizational culture, the way of thinking, and they're not serving that independent role that regulators are looking for and investors as well. So those are a couple of examples that we're seeing that I think is a good thing, and it's a validation of the interest in governance, the interest in improving director education and improving the skills and resources that are available for directors that the Conference Board puts out and through our Directors College as well. But those are some of the things that we think are interesting in the changing dynamic there.
Michael, unfortunately, we're getting near the end of our time, but there's one point you raised that I'd like to pick up on just a little bit, which I will just label as diversity. And that is, because you talked about boards some years ago where it's the same group of men, and in Canada, as in the United States, that meant the same group of white males, and certainly in the United States, we have seen a greater effort to diversify boards. Appropriately so. When you have diversity, you have different points of view. You have different life experiences. You may have different professional experiences. Is that something you're seeing more of in Canada as well?
It is. We've had our main regulator introduced some regulations last year around getting companies to disclose the number of women who are in the senior executive role, women who are on the board, to talk about, it's a comply or explain approach, so do they have a diversity policy? Do they have a diversity strategy? And we've looked at, here at the Conference Board, we've done quite a lot of research. We've worked with a group called, up here in Canada, called the Canadian Board Diversity Council. And we've been the lead research organization for this group for the past 6 years. And they do an annual review of the diversity of the SP 500, which is sort of Canada's largest companies, and looking at the diversity of those boards. And it looks at diversity from male, female, but also other indicators. And there's some interesting findings in that. The diversity is pretty, the increase in diversity, it is growing. We're up now, our last review, there were 19% of the board seats in Canada were held by women. Interesting, our finance and insurance, the banking sector, they have one of the highest rates of diversity, and our utilities do. The utilities in Canada are often held, they're crown corporations, so they're sort of state-owned, so there's a little more ability for the state to, because the state appoints the directors, they can sort of guide, and they've been pushing for a little more diversity on the boards that way. But the banking sector is interesting there, and of course, a major industry for Canada is the mining and oil and gas sector. And this past year, 2015, was the first year that group cracked 10% of the number of boards that were held by women. And what we've done, which I think is very interesting, for the first couple of years, we would ask a question around, you get all these details, how old are you? Almost all directors are of a certain age bracket. Almost all of them are in Canada, speak French or English as a first language, and most are white. And we would ask them about, okay, so do you think your board is diverse? And we would get very strong indications from the directors that, yes, they do think their board is diverse. So 85, 90% of the directors would say, yeah, we're diverse. So that, of course, was a question for us. Why does that happen? So beginning last year, we started to talk to them about, okay, well, what do you mean? When you look at your board, where do you have diversity and where don't you? And what we found is that things that are related to business expertise, so management experience, functional area of expertise, education, industry experience, those are areas where the directors themselves are saying we've got substantial diversity on the board. And then when you look at things around gender or age or ethnicity or visible minorities, those are all areas where they see, they don't have, there's either moderate diversity or we have a significant lack of diversity. So they're recognizing that when they're sort of asked specifically, they say, well, we're not diverse in those areas. But the interesting thing is the thing that is really that they see as crucial is the management experience, the functional experience. And that's led me to say that one of the biggest challenges in advancing diversity is going to be directors' own perspective. Because if they are hearing we need to be more diverse and they look around and they see diversity as really hinging on management experience and functional area of expertise, any further pushes for other kinds of diversity of perspective, diversity of experience that comes from a diverse background is going to be a really tough thing for them to voluntarily want to change, because they're not going to see the value in that necessarily. So I think that's an interesting dimension around what we need to do in Canada, thinking about diversity, broadening the definition, and helping to build that case for what diversity means in a meaningful way that's not just focused on management experience and industry expertise. So that's where we sit on that diversity file.
Well, Michael, unfortunately, we now are at the end of our time, but I was wondering if anyone wanted additional information on the Conference Board of Canada or wanted to follow up with you. Could they go to a website, or if so, how would they do so?
Absolutely. So our website is conferenceboard.ca, and my email is just Bassett, Bassett, at conferenceboard.ca, and we'll welcome any additional comments or questions. We're always interested in learning more. As a research organization, it's always great to get questions and to sort of have to think about things. So I'd encourage folks to reach out to me that way as well.
Well, Michael, thanks very much, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I have 2 calls to action for you. If you could rate this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it. The second thing is, if you have any questions, please email them to me at tfox@tfoxlaw for my next mailbag issue. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening.